Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I know it has been a little while since my last one. Things have been a little hectic and a little crazy for me, but I'm here today to talk about something a little interesting, a little different than what I normally talk about. Today I wanted to talk about this influx of head coaching signings that we've been seeing in the past week, and specifically the three head coaches that we've seen come out of what I'm going to refer to as Crusty's coaching tree, and I want to talk a little bit about that idea and my thoughts on it. So I'm going to do a little bit of a bit of meat sports discussion here for just a couple minutes, just to explain what I'm talking about. But recently we saw a number of head coaching signings happen across the league. Of course, the Philadelphia Fusion bringing in 9K to be their head coach. The Houston Outlaws bringing in Junkbuck to be a co-head coach alongside Harsha. And you also have the Guangzhou Charge bringing in Arachne to be a head coach. All three of them served under Crusty at some point in time. 9K back in 2019, Arachne and Junkbuck up until just this past season. So three head coaches who have served under Crusty are now head coaches. So it's an interesting thing to see. And this is something that we see in the NFL, especially. That's what I'm the most familiar with, where you see head coaches who are really successful, that have a long tenure, that find a lot of success, tend to create good assistant coaches and players who can then become head coaches elsewhere and succeed. And if you look at the NFL, for example, the two big kind of head coaches that have produced these big coaching trees are Bill Belichick for the New England Patriots and Andy Reid for the Kansas City Chiefs, and formerly the Philadelphia Eagles. And so those two men have produced a ton of different NFL head coaches. With Bill Belichick, you have the Tennessee Titans head coach, the Arizona Cardinals head coach, the Detroit Lions head coach, the Houston Texans head coach, the New York Giants head coach, a couple others. With Andy Reid, you have the Baltimore Ravens head coach, the Eagles head coach, the Colts head coach, and some others as well. They make up a ton of different head coaching jobs in the league because they have been super successful such a prolonged period of time that their assistant coaches and their players have learned from them, have learned the tips and tricks of coaching, and they have picked up those tricks, and they've learned from the best to become a strong coach. And I think that's what we're starting now to see happen in the Overwatch League, where Crusty and his influence and his coaching style is now spreading to other teams in the league and other coaches. Now, you could argue that Rush is a part of Crusty's coaching tree because Rush worked under 9K with the Paris Eternal, where 9K was general manager and Rush was the head coach. Now, of course, Rush has left Paris and is now with Dallas. So there's a possibility that Rush picked up on some of the Crusty philosophy through 9K, but I'll stick for now just with Junkbuck and 9K and Arachne. And if you look at the current San Francisco Shock coaching staff, they've added a couple new coaches to their team. Casaurus, who was an analyst going into the playoffs, has been promoted to an assistant coach, as well as Agape, of course, the former assistant coach for the London Spitfire. So two pretty big names in assistant coaches. Casaurus, I know, was with the Atlanta Reign for a time as a coach. I think he was just an assistant coach. I'm not exactly sure what he was doing there, but he is someone who has been in the Overwatch League once before as a coach and is now back in the Overwatch League with the San Francisco Shock as an assistant coach. And then, of course, like I said, Agape, former London Spitfire head coach. I would expect both of those two to be hot commodities this offseason. Very possible that they become potential head coaching candidates. If you're going to build a Western team, you're going to go after Kosaurus. And if you need a Korean head coach, Agape, who's already had success with the London Spitfire in 2018 and in 2019 and in some sense in 2020. Now he's working under Crusty, where he can kind of become an even better coach. So I think it's an interesting thing to see that we're watching Krusty's assistants become more and more prominent. And these aren't like 9K is the head coach of the Philadelphia Fusion, like a really good team, one of the top teams in the league this past season, and he is now the head coach of that team. So that is a huge promotion and huge step forward for a Fusion team who struggled a bit at the end of 2020. Now you have 9K coming in to be your coach, who has worked under the best coach in the Overwatch League. And I think you're going to see a lot of growth from this Fusion roster as a result. You're going to have a change in philosophy. You're going to have that shock mentality come into this team and make a lot of changes potentially and kind of shore up this roster and make this roster work better and make it a tighter roster, and fix up and clean up some of those problems they had late in the season. You know, they struggled to adapt at times. They never really looked the most organized. They had a lot of talent, but not a ton of really good coordination. And a lot of times, it was a whole thing that had kind of happened with the team where they had struggled with situations, especially with struggling to have a strong sense of teamwork and coordination that allowed them to really kind of beat some of those really top level teams like the Shock and the Dragons. They beat the Shock once. They didn't beat the Dragons. They didn't beat the Dynasty. So it's a big signing for them bringing in someone like 9K, because he brings with him the experience of working alongside the best head coach in Overwatch League history, in Overwatch history, arguably, in Crusty. So I think it's an interesting thing to look at, and I'm curious to see how this team works together without some of these coaches. The San Francisco Shock team is going to be interesting to watch. Can Crusty really just kind of keep cranking out new coaches and just keep making these head coaches every season and just keep losing coaches to head coaching positions? Some of them will work, some of them won't work. That's just the nature of what happens with the kind of coaching trees. Is typically you have coaches that don't work and coaches that do work, and that's just kind of the reality of what happens. But I'm interested in seeing what happens and how successful this is, because it is the type of thing that happens when you have really good teams and really good head coaches. Is their assistant coaches become head coaches, and in some instances those assistant coaches tend to have more success against the person who was their coach, their mentor, because they know how their mentor thinks in a way that other coaches don't necessarily know and don't have that same knowledge of. So it's interesting to see. I'm curious to see how some of these teams perform. 9K to me is the huge coach signing. I think that's going to be the really interesting one. We had a Fusion team that was already really good last year. They might be even better going into next season, because they're probably going to clean up their roster. They have another season under their belt of working together, so you kind of figure out what works. You can kind of bring in pieces to fill in where you think you have some gaps potentially, and you have an upgraded head coach potentially bringing in 9K. I think the Guangzhou Charge will be interesting. They've made a decent number of changes. Obviously, if they get a new main support, it looks like they'll probably keep most of their roster other than that, but they have to, like I said, get a new main support in there. But with Arachne as head coach, he could definitely bring in a ton of changes and bring with him a bunch of improvements to a roster that's already pretty good. He might be the thing that cleans it up. And Junkbuck was a really instrumental piece of the Team USA World Cup win back in 2019. So he's another coach who I think brings a ton to building a really strong Western roster alongside Harsha, who also was one of the coaches during that 2019 World Cup run. Most of what I've heard is that Junkbuck really was kind of the mastermind behind what happened for the USA World Cup team in 2019. So I'm really interested to see how these coaches perform. I'm really interested to see how these coaches take these head coaching jobs and what they do with them and how they perform, because to me it's what these coaches obviously been waiting for. They want to become head coaches. They want the ability to prove themselves and to be these performers. And I'm really interested in seeing and excited to see what happens with Crusty's former assistants becoming head coaches. But that is all I really want to talk about today. Let me know your thoughts on this topic in the comments down below. But that is all for me. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this in the future. I hope you are all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye bye.